The steam curled up from the locomotive stack and hung in the still summer air of Prescott Junction, Arizona Territory, in the year 1881, and Leanne Zhao stood beneath it, clutching a single trunk that held everything she owned in the world. She was 27 years old, and she had crossed an ocean and 2 territories on the strength of 8 months of letters from a man who was nowhere on the platform to meet her. The letters had promised a house with a real glass window and a husband who valued honesty above all things. What she found instead, once the crowd of disembarking passengers thinned and the whistle's echo died against the hills, was an empty stretch of boards and the particular hollow silence of a promise that had come apart somewhere between one territory and the next. The platform itself was a crowded, noisy place, thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron, crates of freight stacked along one wall waiting for wagons, a porter calling out destinations that meant nothing to her, and beneath all of it, the particular loneliness of standing in a crowd where not a single face turned toward her with recognition. Women in traveling dresses embraced men who had come to collect them. A drover shouted greetings to a cousin he had not seen in 3 years. Nobody called her name. Nobody looked for her at all. She wandered the length of the platform twice, scanning every weathered face for the one described in his letters, a tall man with brown hair and a scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall. No such man appeared. What appeared instead, eventually, was a rancher named Ezra Whitcomb, standing near the baggage cart with a satchel of fence wire in his hand, watching her with the particular stillness of a man who had noticed something wrong and could not make himself look away from it. Ezra was 34, unmarried, and had come into town that morning for supplies, not for anything resembling the scene now unfolding in front of him. He had run cattle on his father's 1,100 acres for going on 15 years, through drought and hard winters and one very bad season with wolves, and none of that had prepared him for the particular ache of watching a stranger search a crowd for a face that clearly was not coming. He noticed her hands first, the way they kept smoothing the same fold of her sleeve over and over, a small motion that seemed to be the only thing keeping her upright. He should have loaded his wire and gone home. Instead, he found himself crossing the platform toward her, his boots loud on the boards, and when she turned to face him, there was a flash of wariness in her eyes, the particular caution of someone who had learned that strangers rarely approached with good intentions. "Ma'am," he said, stopping a respectful distance away, "you've got the look of a woman who was told somebody would be here." She studied him a long moment before answering, taking in the plain vest, the calloused hands, the hat pushed back enough to show his whole face. "I was told a great many things," she said, her English careful and precise, each word set like a stone into mortar. "None of them appear to be true today." "Who were you expecting?" "A man named Walton Ferris. He wrote to me for 8 months. He said he owned land near here and needed a wife who could keep accounts and manage a household properly." She looked past his shoulder at the last of the platform crowd being swallowed into wagons. "He is not here." Ezra had heard of Walton Ferris, in the unflattering way a man becomes known when he owes money to half the merchants in a county and has a habit of vanishing when a debt comes due. He had heard, only 2 weeks back, that Ferris had sold off the last of his stock and left for California ahead of a warrant for unpaid freight charges. He had not connected that gossip to any bride until this moment, and something cold settled into his chest as the pieces fell together. "Ferris left the territory," he said, "because there was no gentle way around the truth, and he did not believe in lying to a person about her own circumstances. 2 weeks passed. Owed money all over town. I doubt he's coming back for you or anybody." She did not cry, though something moved behind her eyes that suggested the effort of holding it back. She only nodded once, the nod of a suspicion confirmed rather than a surprise delivered. "Then I have crossed an ocean for a man who was never going to meet me at all." "Looks that way," Ezra said, shifting his weight, aware he had wandered into a conversation with no clear exit. "You got people back where you started? Someone to wire?" "My family arranged this match through a matchmaker in San Francisco. There is no home to return to. My father's debts required that I marry, and a marriage at a distance was the arrangement that settled them." She said it plainly, without self-pity, a fact long since made peace with. "I have very little money and no ticket anywhere, Mr. "Whitcomb. Ezra Whitcomb."
"Mr. Whitcomb." She extended her hand in the formal manner she had likely been taught was proper custom, and he shook it, feeling how cold her fingers were despite the summer heat pressing down on the boards. "I am Lian Zhao. I do not know what I am meant to do now." He did not have an answer, not one that made sense to offer a stranger he had known 4 minutes, but the question hung there between them, and later he would understand this was the moment the whole shape of his life quietly changed direction, though nothing about it felt dramatic at the time. A freight wagon rattled past behind them, and somewhere down the platform a dog barked at the departing train, and the ordinary noise of the world went on, entirely unconcerned with the fact that 2 strangers had just stepped, without meaning to, onto the edge of something neither of them could yet name. But the platform was not an empty stage where 2 people could settle things privately. A cluster of townsfolk had gathered near the freight office, drawn by the arriving train, and among them stood Grover Pemberton, who ran the mercantile and considered himself the settlement's unofficial judge of who belonged and who did not. He had watched the exchange with open curiosity, and when Leanne's situation became clear to the gathered crowd, his voice rose loud enough to carry the platform's full length. "That's Ferris's mail-order girl," Grover said to no one and everyone at once. "Chinese girl, come all this way for nothing. Somebody ought to put her back on that train before she becomes this town's trouble." Leanne's spine went rigid, though she did not turn to face the crowd directly. Ezra watched her jaw tighten, watched her nervous hands still and fold together in front of her, and understood she had heard versions of this before, in other towns, from other mouths, and had trained herself not to flinch even when the words landed like stones. "She isn't anybody's trouble, Grover," Ezra said, loud enough to carry the same distance. "She's a person standing on a platform who got lied to by a man who owes you money too, if memory serves." That silenced Grover for a moment, though his face made clear the matter was not settled. "Doesn't change that she's got nowhere to go and no business staying," he said. "This isn't a charity house." "No," Ezra agreed. "It's a train platform in a free territory, and she's got as much right to stand on it as you do." He turned back to Leanne, aware that half the gathered crowd now watched them with the hungry attention small towns save for anything resembling scandal. "You said you can keep accounts." "I kept my father's ledgers for 6 years," she said.
"I read, write, and calculate in both English and my own tongue." "I could use a bookkeeper," Ezra said, which was not entirely true since he had managed his own accounts well enough with a stub of pencil and a battered notebook, but it felt like the only decent offer available that would not sound like charity and would not sound improper either. "Room and board and fair wages until you've got enough put by to go wherever you choose. Separate quarters. My housekeeper, Nora Pruitt, lives on the property and can vouch for the arrangement being proper." Grover made a sound of disgust behind them, but Ezra did not turn around, and Leanne, after studying his face for whatever signs of dishonesty she had learned to look for during 8 months of correspondence with a man who had turned out entirely false, gave a small, careful nod. "I accept," she said, "on the condition that it is exactly as you have described it." "It is," Ezra said.
You have my word." Word, however, was a fragile currency in a town like Prescott Junction, and by the time Ezra's wagon had rattled out past the last buildings toward the ranch, gossip had already begun traveling faster than any horse, carried on the tongues of the crowd that had witnessed the exchange. Leanne sat beside him on the wagon seat, her trunk lashed behind them, watching the town give way to open scrub and rolling grassland, and though neither of them spoke for the better part of the ride, the silence between them was not unkind. It was, she thought, the first quiet she had felt since stepping off the train, the first hour in weeks that had not required her to defend or explain herself to anyone. The ranch sat in a shallow valley ringed by low, dry hills. A modest, clapboard house with a wide porch Ezra's father had built with his own hands, a barn weathered silver by decades of sun, and beyond it the corrals where a dozen cow ponies stood switching flies in the heat. Nora Pruitt, a widow in her 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, met the wagon at the gate with her hands on her hips and an expression that suggested she had already heard the shape of the story. "You've brought home a stray," Nora said, though without real malice, only the exasperation of a woman accustomed to Ezra's habit of taking in wounded animals and broken machinery, and now, apparently, people. "She needs work and a place to stay," Ezra said, helping Leanne down. "I need someone who can keep the accounts straight instead of me guessing at 'em come quarter's end." Nora studied Leanne a long moment, the kind of assessment that misses nothing, and something in her hard face softened by a fraction. "Well," she said, "you'll be wanting supper. Come on, then. I don't stand around jawing while good food goes cold." That first evening set the pattern for the weeks that followed. Leanne took to the ledgers with an efficiency that surprised even Ezra, who had expected to spend time explaining the ranch's finances, and instead found her asking sharp, precise questions about feed costs and beef prices that revealed a mind the town had never credited her with. She noticed within days that Ezra had been overpaying the feed merchant in town by a small but steady margin, a discrepancy no one had caught in 3 years of ledgers kept by hand and haste. She noticed, too, that the calving records showed a pattern worth watching, a handful of cows that consistently produced weaker stock, and she suggested, carefully, that those animals might be sold rather than bred again. Ezra listened to all of it with the particular quiet of a man unused to being taught anything about his own land, and found, to his mild surprise, that he did not resent it. She worked at the kitchen table each evening by lamplight, her pencil moving in tidy columns, and Ezra found himself lingering in the kitchen longer than the accounts required, drawn by something in her quiet concentration he could not name. Nora noticed it too, in the particular way an older woman notices these things long before either party involved is willing to admit it themselves, and she said nothing, only smiled faintly to herself over the wash basin some evenings, and let the two of them alone with their ledgers and their careful, growing silences. But the town did not let the arrangement rest easy. Within a week, whispers had reached a pitch too loud to ignore, and it was Cordelia Ashgrove, wife of the town's banker, who took it upon herself to confront the matter when Ezra came into the bank about a loan renewal on his grazing land. "People are talking, Mr. Whitcomb," Cordelia said, her voice pitched low but carrying the authority of a woman who believed herself the keeper of the settlement's moral order. A single man, a foreign woman living under his roof with no proper chaperone but a housekeeper. It reflects poorly on the whole community. "Nora Pruitt lives on the property full time," Ezra said. "There's nothing improper happening, Mrs. Ashgrove." "Perception is its own kind of truth out here," Cordelia said. "You'll find the bank looks more favorably on loans to men whose households reflect well on the town." It was not said as an outright threat, but Ezra understood its shape well enough, and he left the bank with his loan renewal unresolved and a heavy, cold feeling settling into his chest that had nothing to do with cattle prices. He rode home slower than usual that afternoon, turning the conversation over in his mind, and did not mention it to Leanne that evening, though she noticed, in the way she seemed to notice most things, that something weighed on him. She did not press him for it. She had learned, in her short time under his roof, that he was a man who worked his troubles loose in his own time, and that pressing him only drove the trouble deeper. The bigger crisis arrived 10 days later in the form of a grass fire that started on the dry eastern boundary of Ezra's land, where a careless traveler's abandoned campfire caught the tender dry brush and spread with terrifying speed under a hot afternoon wind. Ezra was 3 miles out checking fence when the smoke column rose black against the pale sky, and by the time he reached the house at a dead gallop, the fire had already crossed onto the near pasture, moving toward the barn and the corrals where half his herd stood penned. What he found there stopped him cold for the length of one startled breath. Leanne was already at the corral gates, working the latches free with quick, sure hands, driving the frightened, wheeling horses out toward open ground, her skirts torn and singed at the hem, her face streaked with smoke and sweat, but her movements deliberate, entirely without panic. "The wind is turning," she shouted over the roar of the approaching fire, not waiting for instruction, already moving toward the second corral where a handful of yearling cattle bawled in terror. "We must open the low pasture gate before it reaches the barn." Ezra swung down and ran to help her, and together they worked the gates and drove the panicked stock toward the creek bottom where the wet ground would stop the fire's advance. Smoke rolled thick and black across the yard, stinging their eyes, and twice Leanne pulled Ezra back from a section of fence about to buckle under the heat before he had even seen the danger himself. The flames came within 30 yards of the barn before the wind shifted and the fire guttered against the creek's damp margin, and when it was over, Ezra found himself standing in the trampled mud looking at Leanne as though he had never truly seen her before. "You knew what to do," he said, still catching his breath. "How did you know?" "There was a fire in the village where I grew up," she said, wiping soot from her cheek. "I was young. I remember what panic does to people and what it does not do. It does not put out fires." Nora arrived from the house minutes later with water buckets and a face gone pale with worry, and finding both of them upright and the barn still standing, she set the buckets down hard enough to slosh water over the rim, and said only, "Well, thank the Lord for small mercies," before turning back toward the house to see about supper, as though nothing at all extraordinary had just occurred, which was, Ezra thought, very much her way of showing how frightened she had been. That night, after Nora had gone to her own small quarters, Ezra found Leanne alone on the porch steps, still smelling faintly of smoke, looking out at the dark hills. He sat beside her without asking, close enough to speak quietly, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. "I owe you my barn and half my herd," he finally said. "Maybe more than that." "You owe me nothing," Leanne said. "You gave me a place when I had none. This was only repayment." "It wasn't a loan, Leanne. It was a kindness. Those aren't things people usually repay with their own safety." She was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its careful formality, as though the fire had burned away a barrier along with the dry grass. "I have spent my whole life being useful to people who did not value me beyond what use I provided. My father valued my ledgers, not me. Walton Ferris valued the dowry payment my family sent ahead, not the woman who would arrive to spend it. I have learned not to expect anything different." She turned to look at him directly. "You are the first person in a very long while who has not made me feel like a transaction." Ezra sat with that a moment. "I'm not a man of many words, Leanne. Never have been. But I want you to know I don't see you as a transaction, and never have. Not from the first minute on that platform." "I know," she said quietly. "That is why I am still here." It was not a declaration, not yet, but it was the first honest thing either of them had said aloud, and something shifted permanently between them in the quiet dark of that porch. They sat there a good while longer, until the smoke smell had thinned in the night air, and the stars had come up hard and bright over the scorched pasture. And when Leanne finally rose to go inside, Ezra found himself watching the door long after it had closed behind her, turning over the strange, sudden weight of what he was beginning to feel. The following week, pressure from town arrived more directly. Grover Pemberton and two other merchants rode out on a Saturday afternoon, faces set with the grim purpose of men who believe they are protecting something. They found Ezra at the corral and did not waste time on pleasantries. "We've come about the arrangement," Grover said, glancing toward the house where Leanne could be seen through the window, bent over the ledger. "The bank's called your loan for review on account of the household situation. Ashgrove sent us as much as told us so. There's talk of a petition, too, asking the marshal to look into whether the girl's presence here is proper under territorial law." "There's no law against a man employing a bookkeeper," Ezra said, jaw tight. "There's laws about decency, Whitcomb, and there's the plain fact this town doesn't take kindly to a man keeping a Chinese woman under his roof without a proper arrangement to make it respectable." Grover's voice carried the smugness of a man certain he held all the leverage. "Send her back east, or marry her proper, or the bank calls your note in full by month's end, and you lose this ranch, same as your daddy nearly did in the drought of '74. The threat landed exactly as intended, a cold weight settling into Ezra's stomach, because he knew the bank held enough leverage to make good on it, and knew too that 1,100 acres his father had bled to prove up could vanish inside a season if Ashgrove chose to press the matter. He said nothing further to the three men, only watched them ride back toward town, and then stood at the corral fence a long while before finally walking back to the house, the weight of the decision ahead of him settling heavier with every step across the yard. Leanne had heard enough through the open window to understand what had happened, and when Ezra came inside she closed the ledger and folded her hands on the table, her expression composed in the way he now recognized as the mask she wore when something had wounded her deeply. "I will leave," she said before he could speak. "I will not be the reason you lose everything your father built." "No," Ezra said, more sharply than he intended, then softer. "No, that isn't what I want." "Then what do you want, Ezra?" Her voice cracked slightly on his given name, the first time she had used it without formal address, and the sound undid something in him. "I want to marry you," he said, plainer and more abrupt than he had ever imagined saying it, with none of the careful courtship a man was supposed to offer. "Not because the bank is holding a gun to my head, because I've been falling for you since the day you drove those cattle out of a burning corral without so much as a tremble in your hands. And I've been too much a coward to say it until a man like Grover Pemberton forced my hand." Leanne sat very still, her eyes searching his face for any sign of falseness, the same searching look she had given him on the platform weeks before. And this time what she found satisfied her, because something eased in her shoulders, some long-held tension releasing at last. "I am not pretty," she said quietly, and it was clear this was not fishing for a compliment, but a plain statement of fact as she understood it. a wound inflicted long ago by someone who had told her so and never bothered to retract it. I am not the sort of woman men write poems about. I am practical, and I am tired, and I have very little left to offer besides my labor and my honesty. That's fine, Ezra said, and reached across the table to take her hand, his calloused fingers closing gently around hers. I don't need fancy. I need honest. I've had enough fancy talk from bankers and merchants who'd sell their own mothers for a good word in the county paper. I need somebody who tells me the truth and stands beside me when the fire comes. That's you, Leanne. That's always been you since the first minute I saw you standing on that platform. She did not answer in words. She only turned her hand in his so their fingers laced together properly, and the quiet that followed said more than any speech could have. They were married 11 days later by a circuit preacher who came through Prescott Junction twice a year, in a ceremony small enough to fit on the front porch, attended by Nora Pruitt and a handful of ranch hands, and, to the surprise of nearly everyone, by Cordelia Ashgrove herself, who arrived unannounced that morning with a jar of preserves and an expression suggesting she had reconsidered her earlier position after hearing, through the reliable channel of town gossip, how Leanne had saved half a herd from a grass fire with her own 2 hands. Ezra wore his one good coat, brushed clean of dust for the occasion, and Leanne wore a plain blue dress Nora had helped her sew from cloth bought at Grover Pemberton's own mercantile, a small irony none of them mentioned aloud, but all of them privately enjoyed. The preacher spoke the vows plainly, without excess ceremony, and when Ezra slipped a simple gold band onto Leanne's finger, purchased with 3 weeks of saved wages, she looked at it for a long moment before looking up at him with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. The bank's loan review quietly resolved once the marriage was official, and Grover Pemberton's petition to the marshal died a quiet death for lack of actual signatures, since most of the settlement's residents turned out considerably less interested in the arrangement than Grover had assumed, especially once word spread of how she had saved the Whitcomb barn with her own 2 hands while half the men in town had done nothing but talk. 3 months passed, and the ranch that had once teetered on the edge of the bank's patience now stood on steadier ground than it had in years. Leanne's careful management of the accounts had trimmed waste from the operation Ezra had never noticed, catching a supplier who had been shorting their wire orders for the better part of 2 years, and negotiating better terms on winter feed that saved the ranch nearly $40 before the first frost. The herd, rebuilt and expanded with the money saved, numbered 30 head more than before the fire. The ledgers she kept were referenced now not just by Ezra, but by 2 neighboring ranchers who paid her a small fee to review their own books, work she did evenings at the same kitchen table where she had first proven her worth, and the income set in a small tin box under the floorboard, money entirely her own for the first time in her life. Nora Pruitt, who had once called Leanne a stray, now referred to her simply as the smartest woman in the county, said loudly and often within earshot of anyone who might once have doubted it, and had taken, in recent weeks, to teaching Leanne her grandmother's recipe for dried apple pie, a small domestic ritual that had become, without either woman quite remarking on it, a kind of quiet friendship neither had expected to find. And on a warm evening in early autumn, Ezra found his wife on the same porch steps where he had first spoken honestly to her, watching the light fade gold over hills that were now, in every legal and practical sense, as much hers as his. "I remember the platform often," she said, when he sat beside her, a small private smile touching her mouth. "How lost I felt. How certain I was that nothing good could come from that day." "And now?" Ezra asked, taking her hand the way he had taken to doing every evening since the wedding. "Now I have a home, a husband who tells me the truth, and money of my own that no one can take from me." She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the last light slip below the hills. "I did not expect to find any of that on a train platform. I did not expect to find it at all." "Neither did I," Ezra said. "But I'm glad the fool who was supposed to meet you never showed." She laughed then, a real laugh, unguarded, the sound of a woman who had finally stopped waiting for the ground to shift beneath her, and the two of them sat together as the sky darkened over the ranch that had nearly been lost, and instead had been saved by the very woman the whole town had once tried to send away. Somewhere out past the corral, a horse nickered softly in the dusk, and the last of the swallows dipped low over the barn roof that still stood, whole and steady, exactly where it had always been. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.